In the ancient Mediterranean world of the Gospels, marriage, divorce, and adultery have very different meanings than what 21st century Western Christians understand by these terms. No matter what Catholic teachers tell you, Western Christians don't practice biblical marriage. Biblical marriages were between families. And unlike the engagements and marriages of which we are familiar, biblical marriage partners were not self-selecting. That's because biblical marriages were arranged. Each Israelite family selected a partner, and the union produced was intended to bind the families together, to pool both families' honor. This shared honor formed a stronger unit, a more formidable in-group. This was the same all over the ancient circum-Mediterranean world. Ancient Mediterraneans like Jesus believed that just as children cannot choose their parents, so too children could not choose their marriage partners. For Jesus and other ancient Israelites, the God of Israel chose the parents, and through one's parents, God chose the marriage partners. Hence Jesus' cultural truism about marriage in Mark chapter 10, verse 9. What God has joined together, let no one separate. For Jesus and pretty much almost every Mediterranean at his time, divorce was unacceptable. Why? Well, it should be evident to you if you understand the nature of ancient Mediterranean marriages. The only marriage that you can find in the Mediterranean Bible. The only marriage that Jesus knew. Unlike American divorce, Mediterranean biblical divorce is not just the separation of two partners, but instead the separation of two families. Biblical society, like all Mediterranean societies, was driven by the values of honor and shame. Jesus understands that if a divorce happens between two first-century Israelite families, the family of the bride will be shamed. In particular, the bride's male relatives would bear the shame in public, as well as the responsibility to remedy it. Inescapably, feuding will result. Blood feud will engulf the village. In the Middle East, when blood feud happens, it is game over. And this is why Jesus forbids divorce. Context is crucial, friends. Notice that Jesus is not talking about marriage and divorce as presented by contemporary Catholic teaching, or as understood by other Western people today. People today can imagine various scenarios where divorce and remarriage are not only allowable, but in fact would be the healthy course of action. But imagine the misery produced by fundamentalistically misreading Jesus, mistaking him to be talking about marriage and divorce in any cultural setting, at any historical period, like the way we Western people understand. It would be disastrous.
My parents did not get along. That's a serious understatement. But they would not divorce, because they understood the Bible to prohibit it. And the moral and theological authority of the Bible in the life of the Christian meant no divorce. So they stuck it out until the day they died. Bad idea in my view, but they took the authority of the Bible seriously.
Last time we talked about how Jesus forbade divorce in the gospel called Mark. We learned that marriage and divorce are very different in the cultural world of the Bible than they are in the modern Western world. Today, people in our culture marry as self-selecting partners, but in the ancient biblical world, marriage was arranged. Today, marriage is seen as the unity of two people coming together, but in the ancient world, marriage was the union of two families. And divorce is the breaking up of two families in an honor-shame culture. That's biblical divorce. And that brings with it the threat of blood feud. Factors become more complicated when we continue reading in the Gospel of Mark chapter 10 and hear about Jesus' private explanation to his disciples. Jesus talks about remarriage. The discussion isn't just about divorce, which, though bad enough, was permitted by Moses. The problem now hinges on divorce and remarriage. The Mark and Jesus group, writing this gospel decades after the death and resurrection of Jesus, apparently is familiar with a situation in which a woman or a woman's family could initiate divorce. Something very different and completely foreign to the Galilee of Jesus' day. This affront to the husband's family is something so shameful that it must necessarily result in blood feud. Within this social system, remarriage necessarily entails adultery. But the situation is drastically different from that supposed in contemporary Western notions of divorce and adultery. In the Middle Eastern world of the Bible, adultery is a strategy by which one male shames another male, namely the husband of the wife who is a partner in the adultery. Adultery to us is cheating on your spouse, and it can be committed by either the woman or the man. Not in the world of the Bible. Biblical adultery can only be committed by a male. A wife cannot commit biblical adultery. Culturally, it is impossible for her to shame a man's wife. If a husband has relations with any female other than his wife, even if she be a prostitute, he does not and cannot shame his honorable wife. Why? Because in this cultural world, only males can be shamed. What then does it mean when the Mark in Jesus says, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her"? Well, from the Mediterranean cultural perspective, the shame must reflect upon a male. And the males would be the wife's father, brothers, or other significant males in her family. Because of the inevitable bloodshed, such a situation must be avoided at all costs. Therefore, both Jesus and the Markan interpretation of Jesus forbid remarriage. This brings us to a reflection of the Ten Commandments and what they were really originally intended for. The Ten Commandments prohibit behaviors that are precisely affronts of Middle Eastern males against other Middle Eastern males that demand vengeance. Hence, the basic purpose of the Ten Commandments in ancient Israelite society was to stop feuding before it began. The idea was to maintain internal societal harmony and stability. In other words, love of God and love of neighbor. Given everything we have learned, considering that, biblically speaking, marriage was the union of two families, not two self-selecting partners, and that, biblically speaking, divorce is the breakup of two families, leading to violence, and that remarriage means adultery, where males are shamed in an honor-shame culture demanding violent retribution for any dishonor. How does that make you feel about Catholics today shunning other Catholics who get remarried, or barring them from communion? Folks, Jesus was not addressing 21st century Western couples getting and staying married as we understand marriage today. He was not forbidding modern people from getting divorced as we practice divorce. Jesus understood remarriage and adultery in very different ways than we do. To Jesus, the life and death of a community was at stake, because when you have blood feud in the Middle East, it is game over. Thankfully for fundamentalistic types treating the Bible as a set of marching orders for American living, the United States bishops back in 1987 offered some sage advice. Do not go looking in the Bible for all the direct answers for living. Why? Because no United States person helped in the production and composition of the sacred library we call the Bible. So if we ever were to discover any American values in the Bible, well, that would be a bizarre miracle indeed. And if we were ever to find our American lives reflected in the characters and authors of the scriptures, it also would be a bizarre miracle indeed. That's why the United States bishops explained in their 1987 statement on fundamentalism that we are not to seek in the Bible all the direct answers for living, because they cannot be found there. Was Jesus saying in Matthew chapter 19, verse 12 about celibacy? Robert Barron seems to think so. He imagines that Jesus and Paul were religious celibates, even though the historical Paul was likely a widower. Nevertheless, Barron thinks that Paul told his people that though he wouldn't impose celibacy on them, he would prefer that they remain as he is, which of course Barron wrongly thinks was the state of a celibate Western Catholic priest. Barron also imagines that Jesus was a celibate Western Catholic priest, in fact, the celibate Western Catholic priest. He proof texts Matthew chapter 19, verse 12, claiming that Jesus urged his disciples to make themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom. In other words, eschew marriage and embrace celibate religious life. By the way, was Jesus single by choice? Or was he so lowly and of such shameful origins that other Nazareth families considered him to be a bastard, and thus never arranged his marriage with Mary, his mother, whom they disdained? Oblivious to these questions, Barron and others really think that they have strong scriptural support for their views on celibacy. Do they? Was Jesus' saying in Matthew chapter 19, verse 12 really about celibacy? No. In fact, if there was something like our concept of sin evolved with 2,000 years of theological freight back in first century Israel, the time of Jesus, it would have been celibacy. We have to ask, what is the context of Matthew chapter 19, verses 2 through 12? Answer, it concerned marriage and divorce and remarriage after divorce, not celibacy.
Some scholars have noted that the immediate fuller context of the saying, there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, is a discussion about remarriage after divorce, and never was about celibacy. Never. The context of the saying is complex, and tearing that text out of its context is irresponsible. Interpreting the verse on its own out of context is impossible. You can all understand the English sentence, he hit it. But not a single one of you can interpret it. You don't know who he is, you don't know what it is, and you don't know what it means. You can understand it, but you can't interpret it. You need context.
Many people today think that Jesus had to be married. Like my friend, who remarked how unlikely it was that a 30-year-old Jewish man wasn't married. Even if we correct her anachronism and correctly refer to Jesus as a first-century Israelite or first-century Galilean Israelite, I have to admit that, in some ways it is unlikely that a 30-year-old Israelite male would have been unmarried or single. If there was something like sin the way we define it in the first century Israelite world, it would have been celibacy. But you know what's even more unlikely? That the historical Jesus was a romantic Western individualist who went out to engage in Western self-selecting romantic marriage. In fact, that idea isn't only unlikely, but impossible. Biblical peoples practiced arranged marriage. The partners never got engaged. Engagement happens in our Western cultural world, where the partners are romantic, self-selecting partners. Instead, biblical people get betrothed when their parents arranged the marriage. Almost all of those arranged marriages in the Bible were patrilocal, meaning the bride moved into the home of the father of the groom, the main home in a household complex or cluster of small peasant dwellings, maybe 50 to 100 persons total. And biblical marriages were endogamous. The ideal marriage partner being your patrilateral first cousin, your father's brother's child. Understanding that helps us see the makeup of village life throughout Galilee 2,000 years ago. A hamlet like Nazareth would have been made up of first, second, and third cousins. If the historical Jesus, the Nazarene, was married, well, it would have been arranged by village women, ratified by village men, and he would have been married to a cousin in Nazareth, not far off Magdala. By the way, Jesus was very lowly and had shameful, dubious origins. His own fellow villagers likely thought of him as a bastard. Who among the women in Nazareth, the intelligentsia of that village, would dishonor their own family by arranging a shameful marriage with shameless Mary of Nazareth? Do you want to properly appreciate the cultural setting of the wedding in Cana story? Well, then watch the film Wedding in Galilee. I'm going to leave a link in the description below. Although this film is set in the modern-day occupied West Bank, Wedding in Galilee offers many valuable cultural scenarios for understanding Mediterranean weddings. Forget romance, folks. Fathers and mothers prearrange their children's marriages in the cultural world of the Gospels. These pre-selected partners commonly were relatives, ideally a first cousin if available. That's how it was for the patriarchs. At the wedding, most invited guests would also be relatives, but some non-relatives would also be included. Notice how in this story the unnamed mother and Jesus don't hesitate to interfere in this wedding to remedy the shortage of wine? This strongly suggests that Jesus and his unnamed mother were related to the wedding party. Honor was on the line. It would have been very shameful for non-relative guests to interfere in a wedding. The unnamed mother tells her son Jesus they have no wine. Jesus' response to his mother is fascinating. First, in this culture, it was respectful to address unrelated females as gunai, woman, but not your mother. This is extremely unusual. There is no parallel for this in any other ancient piece of literature, Hebrew or Greek. At this point, some escape the difficulty by way of allegory gone wild. They spiritualize the text away, looking for some special symbolism implied in Jesus calling his mother woman. But should we honestly read the text, then a better explanation emerges, one derived from a plausible Mediterranean cultural scenario. After birth, Israelite boys and girls were routinely brought up together exclusively by the women, the mother, the aunts, the sisters, grandmothers, so forth. This culture prized boys, not girls, so even peasant village boys were pampered and spoiled and pleasured by the women. This common Mediterranean practice extends centuries, well into Renaissance times. Get ready for a shock if you take some time to study Mediterranean artwork of the Madonna and Child. So strong is the relationship between mother and firstborn son in the circum-Mediterranean world that we in the West might think of it as codependent personality disorder. But even in the ancient Mediterranean, it was still smothering. Eventually, a rude awakening happened when Mediterranean boys hit puberty. They got dragged into the male world, kicking and screaming, cast out from Eden. And there were no rites of passage for this, no bar mitzvahs. These were not Jews. By 12 years old, the young Israelite man was inescapably inside the hierarchical and brutal world of fellow males. So that his masculine identity emerges, other Israelite males would punish the young man physically to great severity. He who loves his son will whip him often, and beat his ribs while he is young, or else he will become stubborn and disobey you. This is what the sage Jesus ben Sira advises Israelite fathers. You find the same in Proverbs and Hebrews. It colors what the mark in Jesus means when in Gethsemane he calls out to his patron, Abba. He wasn't talking American daddy, folks. Should American Christians raise their sons in this manner? The results will be disastrous: psychopathology and prison time. Haunted his whole life by gender ambiguity and striving to achieve hyper-ethnomasculinity, Mediterranean men like Jesus would attempt to weaken their strong emotional ties with females. There is no privacy in the Mediterranean world of the Gospels. Everyone's business is minding everyone else's business. So it is important that, in this very public society, in this very public celebration of a wedding, a Mediterranean man would seek to demonstrate his independence by rejecting the claims of all women upon him, including those of his mother. And this helps us properly understand the literal sense of, "What to me and to you, woman?" This phrase, literally translated, "What to me and to you?" is sometimes a response of someone who feels unjustly bothered by another. In other instances, the phrase is the answer of someone who refuses to get involved in the affairs of someone else. Considering ancient Mediterranean and Israelite child-rearing practices, one plausible cultural scenario for Jesus' statement to his mother is that Jesus, the adult son, felt unjustly bothered, perhaps even embarrassed by his mother's comment and implied suggestion that he'd get involved and fix the problem with the wine. So his reply would then be an attempt to put distance between himself and his mother, and to publicly declare his independence. Another equally plausible cultural scenario for Jesus' statement is that he did not want to interfere in something he believed that was none of their business. In the gospel called Luke, Jesus rejects the honorable invitation to be a mediator between two brothers, because he judged that the petitioner was motivated by greed rather than by justice denied. But Jesus gives in. Why does Jesus give in? Maybe Mediterranean maternal pressure was just too difficult for him to evade. Even in his adulthood, his Mediterranean mother's wish may have been inescapably Jesus' command. Or perhaps he was genuinely concerned about preserving family honor at a relative's wedding. The traces of Mediterranean culture embedded and hidden into segments of this Johannine story offer us beautiful insights into Jesus, the Mediterranean man, who the fourth gospel tells us early on pitched his tent among us. Jesus is just like us in so many human ways. The circumstances of Jesus' conception and birth, described by the anonymous Third Wave Jesus Group author we call Matthew, take on sharper contours when viewed in their Mediterranean cultural context. Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 to 24. The origins of Jesus, Messiah, are thus. When his mother Mary was betrothed to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found with child through a Holy Spirit. Joseph, her husband, since he was a Tzaddik, yet unwilling to expose her to shame, decided to divorce her leniently. Such was his intention when, look, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary, your wife, into your home, for it is through a holy wind that this child has been conceived in her. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. Look, the woman of childbearing and marriageable age shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. When Joseph awoke, he did as the angel of the Lord had commanded him and took his wife into his home. Let's talk a bit about biblical betrothal and marriage. It would be wrong to consider betrothal as similar to our Western idea of engagement before marriage. Engagement happens between two romantic, self-selecting partners. Betrothal was the initial phase of the biblical marriage process, something radically different than the marriage we know about even in our religious traditions. In the biblical marriage process, prospective spouses, commonly patrilateral first cousins, were set apart for each other. That is betrothal. Though a betrothed couple did not live together, a formal divorce was required to break the public establishment of the betrothal. Sex with a betrothed woman was considered adultery, an act committed by a man to shame or dishonor another man. Biblical marriage, like that between Joseph and Mary, means ancient Mediterranean marriage. In the ancient Mediterranean world, marriages were arranged by mothers and fathers to join extended families and not individuals. The biblical or Mediterranean bride did not expect love. She did not expect companionship. And she did not expect comfort. In this rigidly gender-divided world, men and women had very little contact. Indeed, the weakest emotional bond from this cultural world was that between spouses, because of the arranged nature of their union. Both partners realized that their union was arranged for the political or economic advantage of their families. The entire biblical, i.e. Mediterranean marriage process was a ritualized removal of a woman from her family. The groom's father, normally the brother of the bride's father, offered gifts or services to the bride's father to win the wife he wanted for his son. The bride's father made the final decision. The women of both families, the intelligentsia of the ancient Mediterranean and Middle Eastern village, negotiate the contract to make certain neither family gets shortchanged. But the patriarch of each family ratified the contract publicly. When the groom took the bride into his home, really the house compound of his father in this patrilocal arrangement, the marriage process was completed. Now, in light of all of this, let's discuss Mary's pregnancy. Consider, given the very nosy nature of Mediterranean and Middle Eastern village life, where everybody's business is minding everybody else's business, and there is zero privacy, and given the separation of men from women in this extremely gender-divided cultural world, and given the fact that the betrothed couple were not yet living together, Joseph, as presented in the story, may have been among the last to learn about Mary's pregnancy. The village women, again the intelligentsia of Bethlehem, would have noticed that Mary was not participating in their obligatory monthly ritual purification. Villages like Bethlehem and Nazareth only had one bath. The anonymous author we call Matthew inserts an explanation for his readers. Mary is pregnant by a spirit, a wind, an other than human person that is holy. This is a good spirit who did this. Not a mischievous spirit, not an evil spirit, but a holy spirit. That's all well and good for the readers, but what about Joseph? Well, Joseph will have to learn this in another way. Think about Joseph's predicament. The honor code of the Mediterranean world demands that no one take what properly belongs to another. Mary's child does not belong to Joseph. It's not his. So he hesitates to take it. He also knows that he will be unable to display publicly the tokens of virginity on his wedding night. My friends, if Joseph doesn't act quickly, he will be dishonored. He will be publicly shamed as a cuckold. By law, Joseph is entitled to return Mary to her father and expose her to death. Numbers chapter 5 describes the ordeal Mary would have to undergo. But Joseph is an honorable man and determines to divorce her leniently. There is no such thing as a quiet divorce in this cultural world. Joseph's sense of honor hopes that the rightful father will seize this opportunity to claim the child and marry Mary. In all of his decision-making, Joseph acts very honorably. And Joseph learns the will of the God of Israel. Our Mediterranean ancestors in the faith generally tried to live by the will of God. But how did God make God's will known? And how did people learn it? Elites, such as Herod, resorted to the very expensive option of consulting scripture experts. But ordinary folk, peasants like Joseph, had to rely on ordinary means. The prophet Joel reports a proverb that captures a basic Mediterranean belief. Old men dream dreams, young men see visions. Joseph dreamed dreams. So too did the astrologers. Both Joseph and the astrologers learn God's will in a dream. This is not only the ordinary way of learning God's will, but also an allusion to their age. They must be old men, because old men dream dreams. But remember, because of widespread terrible health and hygiene conditions, less than 5% of the population lived to the age of 30. God personally announces to Joseph the gender of the child. A highly prized male is a special gift of God in this culture, and God also personally assigns the child's name, Jesus. This fact immediately immerses Jesus in honor far surpassing human calculation, and further enhances Joseph's honorable reputation, for God would never honor a shameful person. In an effort to contemporize the biblical record, some modern preachers and creatives online communicating through social media like memes speak about Mary as a pregnant, unwed teenage girl and describe Jesus' family as homeless. Spiritually, we can and should find Christ today, especially in those of our human family so marginalized and trounced upon by systematic injustice. And we must fight against the horror of injustice afflicting them. Having said that, these clever descriptions are ill-suited to Mediterranean culture and are unfair to Mary, Joseph, and Jesus. While the circumstances and embarrassment of Mary's predicament look similar to American experiences, the consequences in her culture were radically different. Saint Joseph is highly misunderstood by many Catholics and other Christians. How can we see Joseph better, meaning in an historically and culturally plausible way? I challenge you to take the following quiz on Joseph. It will help you better understand him, Jesus, and the Gospels. 1. Before Joseph lived with Mary, what was their probable relationship? A. Childhood sweethearts. B. Best friends. C. Both A and B. D. Patrilateral first cousins. 2. When did Joseph and Mary get engaged? A. Following a great amount of prayer. B. After Mary had spent much time in the temple. C. They never were engaged. D. After they fell in love. 3. Which of the following best describes the union of Mary and Joseph? A. A religious union called marriage. B. A civil union called marriage. C. A covenant by which a man and woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole of life, and which is ordered by its nature to the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring. D. The union or the pooling of honor of two Middle Eastern families whereby the two spouses represent the kinship groups. 4. In biblical marriage, God's will means A. That the spouses, a man and a woman, freely choose not under constraint. B. That the consent between the spouses is an indispensable element that makes the marriage. C. Both A and B. D. That the fathers and mothers of bride and groom do the choosing. 5. When, according to the Matthean infancy narrative, Joseph discovers that Mary is pregnant, initially he is A. Overwhelmed and feels unworthy to play a role with the Holy Mother and Holy Child. B. Humiliated as a cuckold, probably the last person in the village to find out about Mary's pregnancy. C. Grateful to the God of Israel. D. None of the above. 6. Who were the first villagers to discover Mary's pregnancy? A. The women, who are the intelligentsia of the Middle Eastern village. B. Joseph, when the angel of the Lord told him. C. Mary's best friend, Joanna. D. Mary's dad, Joachim. 7. How did people find out that Mary was pregnant before living with Joseph? A. The angel of the Lord told them. B. They just knew it had to be a miracle. C. Either when Mary didn't show up at the only village bath at the time each month when the women gathered to cleanse, or when she did show up, tried to hide it but couldn't. D. When Mary went around the village with a tambourine, singing praises to God because she was pregnant. 8. Matthew informs his readers that Joseph was a righteous man. This means that he A. was a morally upstanding person. B. was an Israelite holy man, what anthropologists would call a shaman, someone who can talk with spirits in alternate reality. C. hardly ever did anything to be guilty about. D. someone who prayed a lot. 9. Righteous men like Joseph always want to please God. In Matthew, when Joseph learns of Mary's pregnancy, he does not want to accept the child because A. Joseph knows that the child cannot be his, and to accept the child would therefore make Joseph a thief, something that would displease God. B. He feels radically unworthy before the Holy Mother and Holy Child. C. He feels confused and betrayed. D. None of the above. 10. Because in Matthew, Joseph knows that Mary is pregnant already, that means A. God must have done this. B. The devil must have done this. C. Some other human male must have done this. D. There is no way to consummate the marriage, and therefore no way to show the blood-stained sheet to the village at the wedding feast. This will lead to shame and death. 11. How do Mediterranean people like Joseph solve seemingly impossible dilemmas and crises? A. Just like Americans do, with intelligence and hard work. B. Getting advice from family members and friends. C. Through an alternate state of consciousness experience. D. By talking with a priest. 12. When Joseph took Mary into his house, that means that A. They lied to everyone at the wedding celebration by faking the blood-stained sheet. B. They told everyone that it's okay that Mary was pregnant early because it was God's will. C. They eloped, skipped town, and hid out in a nearby village until things blew over. D. They paid off everyone to keep their mouths shut. 13. How do you imagine Joseph acting as father to Jesus? A. Joseph was a warm and kind-hearted daddy. B. A hard-working but quiet provider for Mary and Jesus. C. Both A and B. D. Like a Middle Eastern North African father, someone mostly absent from a boy's early life. 14. Thinking about Joseph and Mary, what is the strongest emotional bond among Middle Eastern personalities? A. Between mother and firstborn son. B. Between husband and wife. C. Between brothers. D. Between masters and slaves. 15. And what is the weakest emotional bond among Middle Eastern personalities? A. Between mother and firstborn son. B. Between husband and wife. C. Between brothers. D. Between masters and slaves. 16. How do you think Mary would have fared in Joseph's father's home, the patriarchal compound? A. Always suspect and never truly fitting in. B. Loved and cherished as one of the family. C. Reverenced as the Holy Mother of God. D. They didn't live with Joseph's father. The Holy Family was a nuclear family, just like Americans imagine. 17. In the biblical or Mediterranean world, all women in the patriarchal compound do what to their prepubescent sons? A. Teach them to read the Bible and pray. B. Let them play wherever they want. C. Treat them equally with the village girls. D. Spoil them rotten, doting on them and keeping them pampered, pleasured, embraced, and drowned in warmth. 18. Because of their fiercely gender-divided world, with father and all male role models absent, when men of prepubescent males like Jesus grow up, they necessarily are haunted their entire lives by A. A longing for their fathers. B. A sense of deep compassion given them by their mothers and sisters. C. Gender ambiguity. D. A deeper commitment to religion. 19. Because they are forever haunted by the correct answer to the last question, Middle Eastern North African males compensate for this by means of A. Constantly proving their manhood through Middle Eastern North African hyper-ethnomasculinity. B. Trusting in God. C. Listening to the advice mother gives. D. None of the above. 20. Depending on how long he lived past Jesus' puberty, how would Joseph have probably raised the teenage Jesus? A. With deep prayer and teaching him to be a carpenter by trade. B. Like any great daddy would. C. Both A and B. D. By severe physical beatings, conditioning Jesus to withstand any punishment without complaining. 21. Say as an American Christian, I treat the Bible like a manual on how to raise sons or daughters in our American setting. I follow it closely and act out its prescriptions. What probably will be the result? A. Psychopathology and prison time. B. Holy children who fear the Lord. C. The salvation of America. D. Both B and C. 22. What was Joseph's profession? A. Carpenter. B. Teacher. C. Peasant village artisan. D. None of the above. 23. Given Joseph's work, he and his family were A. Middle class. B. Wealthy. C. Poor. D. Extremely poor. 24. Joseph had to travel to find work. This meant he was viewed by others as A. A righteous man who works hard for his family. B. A social deviant. C. Someone famous throughout Galilee. D. Someone with connections. Well, that's it. How do you think you did? To find out, look below in the description for a link to a Patheos blog to find the right answers and gauge how well you know Jesus, Mary, and Joseph as they are presented in the Gospels. Enjoy! How might the Godfather movies help somebody understand what John's Jesus means when he says, "The Father and I are one"? Hundreds of years after the Gospel called John was written, Arians and Athanasians used the text to answer questions it simply was not composed for. So they recontextualized John in order to answer metaphysical questions about Jesus and God. And for the Athanasians who won out, God and Jesus were metaphysically one. Jesus was consubstantial with the Father. But that theological evolution was not what John's Gospel actually said. Instead, John was thinking about Mediterranean patronage, like in the Godfather movies. In the same way that the broker Tom Hagen grants access to the patron Don Vito Corleone. So Jesus, the broker, is relationally one, in this sense, with the God of Israel. Jesus is broker, like Tom Hagen is broker. Jesus is the door or the gate, just like Tom Hagen is the door or the gate. Jesus is the authentic way, the only true way to the patron God of Israel, just like Tom Hagen is to Don Vito Corleone. You can't get access to Don Vito without going through Tom Hagen. Well, according to the Johannine Jesus Group, the same thing applies to Jesus and the God of Israel. And folks, when you think about God as Father and Abba, please forget about American Daddy. That's just a wrong picture. It's culturally inappropriate. Nothing like that existed in the fathers and patrons of first century Israel or the whole Mediterranean world. Instead, think Mediterranean Godfather, Don Corleone, without the criminal stuff. Think patron. That's what the New Testament authors have in mind. Also, the fourth gospel is obsessed with group cohesion. John has too many expressions that say the same thing, and always expresses this central concern of his. So, eating Jesus' flesh and drinking Jesus' blood means the same thing as welcoming Jesus, accepting Jesus, receiving Jesus, believing into Jesus, abiding with Jesus, following Jesus, loving Jesus, keeping the words of Jesus, and so forth. All of this expresses the author's main concern, group cohesion. It's saying the same thing. Stick together. Forever emotionally embed yourself into the Johannine Jesus group. That's what John chapter 13, verse 34 is all about, folks. The new commandment. Really, that is what the whole gospel is talking about. John has too many expressions that mean the same thing. This is very typical of an anti-society's anti-language. By the way, just so people don't misunderstand me and these presentations here on YouTube, by no means am I insisting that these culturally informed historical critical understandings constitute the only understanding, the only reading of what John is saying in the famous John 14 verse 6. Nor would I dare claim that what I am presenting here is the final understanding of John chapter 14 verse 6. No. However, I must insist that this is the first understanding, because Mediterranean culture is the first reading of Scripture. Not the only, not the final. There are many more readings that follow, but it is the first. And let's get the beginning right.